In South America, in South America, a lot of the essentially the empty niches that formed as a result of the large competitors of the terror bird like spracodonts, like cebechids. Uh, these extinctions, these FD niches, were then essentially filled by North American immigrants into South America. Things like bears, dogs, cats would essentially come and fill in these empty predator niches. And a lot of the herbivores that went extinct were also sort of had these niches filled by some of these other North American immigrants. However, there were a few South American immigrants into North America that are still not only did well throughout this time period, but also still exist today. Things like the Virginia opossum, porcupines, and things like armadillos were all originally from South America. But we wouldn't expect that, because they lived in North America for so long. We consider them North American animals, but they were originated in South America, or at least their ancestral population did. Now, of course, you did also have some other extinct species making it into North America. Things like glyptodonts, which are, as I mentioned before, giant armadillo relatives. Also things like ground sloths. But there was also one large carnivore that made its way into North America as well. This is known as Titanus. Titanus is the only North American terror bird that we know to exist. And we actually know that this animal made it to North America around the 5 million year mark because it was considered to be a really good swimmer, right? It would have had to be in order to make its way into North America or end up rafting or something like that. But given that Titanus was expected to be around 300 pounds, it's probably too big for that. So it almost certainly did the island hopping thing of going across the as of yet not quite finished Isthmus of Panama around 5 million years ago. In fact, some of the earliest specimens we have of Titanus originate in Texas, in Corpus Christi, that date around this 5 million year mark. And Titanus is sort of mid-sized for this apex predator morph, so around 5 to 7 feet tall, thought to weigh up to 330 pounds. There were some places like in Wikipedia where they were saying they weighed up to 660 pounds. They didn't give any source, and I couldn't really find any scientific paper that, other than one from 1995, that gave this weight, and more updated estimates say it's not quite that large. So I think this is just Wikipedia being like, oh, this is the biggest number. I'm going to go with that one, despite it being 20 years out of date. So no, Titanus didn't weigh 660 pounds. It was at max probably around 330, maybe 400 pounds, if I'm being generous. And so, Titanus really is there were some remains found in Texas, and I believe there was also one found in California. But the grand majority of the remains of Titanus were found in Florida. And so this indicates that given that it really is only found in really warm states, that it probably was mostly a warmer weather area, right? It probably stuck to really warm climates. For some reason or another, it didn't tend not to do well in places that, got at least decently cold. And given the fact that, by the time Titanus started to sort of go extinct, we were already in the midst of the ice age. So, given that, we believe that the dramatic climate changes that we saw during the ice age period around 2 million to 1.8 million years ago is really what did Titanus in. But when it was around, okay, from the 5 million year mark to this 1.8 million year mark, it was doing quite well. It was competing with some of the more, famous ice age animals like saber-toothed cats, American cheetahs, so on and so forth, even short-faced bears at times. And it was probably preying on prey animals that are relatively similar in terms of their morphology, but taxonomically quite different from what it preyed on in South America. And so, things like deer, horses, camels, tapirs were probably all preyed upon by Titanus. And in fact, this is from the Florida Museum of Natural History, where I do my work. This is exactly the animal that Titanus is getting ready to unalive is a tapir, right? Because tapirs nowadays they live in South America, but they used to live all throughout the United States. But even after the extinction of Titanus 1.8 million years ago, there was one study that dated a small terror bird from this more mesopredator morph of Silopterus that was dated to around 96,000 years ago. So this tells us that if these dates are correct, I know there's some contention about these dates, This means that the smallest terror birds were the ones to survive up until the late Ice Age, the late Pleistocene. And probably because they were relatively general, more of a generalist. They were eating relatively small animals, and you know, so for some reason or another, they were able to succeed Titanus and the other large terror birds. But this also means that, given the fact that humans didn't arrive in the Americas until 23,000 years ago, we never met terror birds, at least as far as science is concerned. And so, despite our imaginations or our nightmares, we would have never had to stare down a, 8 foot tall flightless carnivorous bird. But even if we did, we are really, really good at making giant flightless birds go extinct. Things like the dodo, elephant bird, and the moa in more recent years really go to show that we, are really good at this stuff. The dodo from Mauritius Island, the elephant bird from Madagascar, and the moa from New Zealand all went extinct within a couple hundred years of Europeans arriving, if not prior to that. But we're not just good at killing giant flightless birds, we're good at killing all sorts of different types of birds. These are the confirmed extinctions over the past 500 years. So while terror birds certainly would be scary, probably nothing we couldn't handle. So these are why we're excited. I read all of these in preparation for this talk, and I just want to again thank you guys for having me. Be happy to answer any questions. I actually apologize if my video turned off. I have no idea when that turned off. Oops.
Yes.
That wasn't off for too long, was it? My apologies.
Oh.
I got a new camera, and I thought it would work for me, but I guess not.
Oh.
So my question, early in the presentation, you said that Sucus wasn't a very fast, wasn't really much of a runner, but I've seen articles and studies saying that it was actually very leggy, warm-blooded, and even had a respiratory system similar to the terror birds. So what do you make of that?
Right. Well, when I say a runner, I just mean a runner over long distances, right? Similar to how things like tigers are, not running for super long distances, but they could run really fast over short periods of time, right? And sure, things like Sucus was an archosaur, right? It was related to birds, so it probably did have a more efficient respiratory system than we did. But given how large it was and how relatively heavy it was, from what I understand and from what I've read, it's really not, going to be running the same sort of distances as something like a terror bird is. So you're certainly correct in which they certainly could run fast for a pretty good length of time, but not to the same level as more pursuit predators like wolves, like some of the more lanky terror birds and stuff like that. But excellent question. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
Have any fossilized terror bird eggs been found?
I'm sorry. One more time?
He said, did any fossilized eggs ever were they ever found?
Fossilized eggs. I don't believe so. I'm not absolutely positive on that. If we're talking about specifically forest rockets, I don't believe so, right? Because eggs are even more fragile typically than the bones of birds and things like that. And so you would have to have a really good depositional environment where the eggs would have had to be buried almost instantly, right? And not really been sitting on top of the surface for very long. And so from what I understand, there hasn't really been anything. And to have even like a whole egg of a terror bird that wasn't super fragmented, I mean, you would need like it to be pretty much instantly buried by like a storm event or something like that. So no, I'm not to my knowledge, and I think we'd be pretty hard pressed to find one. There it goes again. Jeez Louise. All right. This is why we don't buy cameras on Amazon. Okay. Well, you gotta be kidding.
Okay, we have another question.
Keep them coming.
So
Yeah.
So Luis, do you have any idea about maybe the age of individuals or lifespan? Kind of,
I don't know if you're able to tell from bones or anything
Mhm.
like that, but curious.
Yeah, from what I've read, right? Because I've done a lot of research on everything terror bird, and also and where I work at the Florida Museum of Natural History, so my colleagues study the terror birds. There hasn't really been a whole lot of work done on that, right? And I believe that is a sort of a research question that is up and open. I would imagine that we could use things like paleonates, like things like what was it called, emus and ostriches as a model for them. Um, but given that they are so distantly related to those organisms, right? Things like ostriches and even like chickens, their young are pretty up and going pretty quickly, right? Baby ostriches are running around, pretty soon after they hatch. Whereas the more close relatives of something like a terror bird, like Forus rhacus, things like falcons and Serramus, are more similar to things like Tweety birds or passerines is probably the more scientific term, to where they're pretty not useless, but they're pretty dependent for parental care for a good while after they're hatched. So I imagine that this means that they might have been pretty. If we were to go more in the passerine and more of the Tweety bird falcon sort of growth pattern, and not the ostrich emu growth pattern, they probably would have taken a little while to get going, right? Probably at least a few, couple months, a few months, given that they're larger birds, to really be able to fend for themselves for a good part. But like passerines and like falcons, once they get to this point, they're pretty self-sufficient. So I imagine that at that point they would reach their adult size pretty rapidly after they become fletchlings. But in terms of an exact timeline, unfortunately, because they're so much bigger, they probably were slower. And I can't really say how long it would necessarily take for a terror bird to reach maximum size, right? I imagine within a few years of fletching, they would get to a scary size for sure. In terms of the lifespan, hard to estimate as well. Something like 15, 20 years sounds about right to me.
Any other questions? Well, this has been fascinating and really, really interesting. When Linda and I were looking at your topics, we were very drawn to this, but we know you have some others. So in the future, we definitely have to have you back for one of your other really cool talks.
Awesome, yeah.
Yes. So thank you so much.
Of course, and I'll make sure my camera works next time. Again, my apologies for that. Hopefully you guys.
Technology